Hello everybody, my name is Mateus Veiga. I'm here today with André Lagôa, Beatriz Mota and Loreena Klein, and we are going to interview Rob de Bruin. It's a huge pleasure. So let's go to our first question. So, since your first article published in 1999 as the first author on Nature Biotechnology until nowadays, when you have collaborated for publications in notarial journals as Science and Nature, how do you see the evolution of the scientific papers and the academic writing in the international scientific community?
Of course, how the publishing system works is that you then publish it in either high journals, mid journals, or low journals. And where you publish, of course, then kind of sets the importance of your findings, right? So it's the impact of your story is largely determined by where you publish, right? Ideally, what we would like to have is a system in which the impact of your story, of your findings, is being assessed by the community and by the future by which people use your findings to drive their work. But especially, of course, in the beginning, back in the 90s, it was all based on where you published and not so much what the impact was. So the biggest difference these days is that you can assess the impact of your studies. And that's not just by citations, because now, of course, with the internet, you can see very quickly how many citations a publication had. Back in the day, that took a little bit longer. So you can see the impact of your story. And of course, with other metrics, like how often is it being mentioned on Twitter or in book chapters. So which are, these metrics, you can assess what the impact of your story is. So that's the biggest evolution from, a couple of decades back to now, is that you can assess the impact of your story just based on the actual impact rather than the journal where you published in. So that has been a little bit of an evolution there, but still your work is being assessed by whether you publish in Nature or whether you publish somewhere else. The other aspect that has changed is, of course, bioRxiv, which wasn't the case in a couple of decades ago. And bioRxiv does not contribute to the impact of your work, but it does allow you to show that you've been productive before you have it published. And this is very important when you apply for funding. You have to show that you've been productive. So even if you haven't published your work, but you have deposited it in bioRxiv, you can show that you've been productive. But that still is seen as less important than it being published in a journal because it hasn't been peer reviewed yet. So hopefully, there is some evolution from before. It was all based on where you publish. Now it's it's still very important where you publish, but at least people can see what the actual impact is of your paper. Plus you can already show that you've been productive by putting it on bioRxiv. In the end, what we're hoping, of course, is that your publications are just based on the impact it has rather than where you publish it. But that will take a long time. People still, if you have a publication in Nature or Science, if they compare that to, 3 or 4 publications in EMBO or still very good journals, they still think you've been more successful if you had that publication in Nature, which is still, I think it's still a big issue. Because if you run a group, let's say 10 people, if you just make sure that one of them publishes in Nature, Science, or Cell, then people think you've been really productive and you've been really successful. Well, how you should be assessed is whether everybody in your group has been able to publish, which would mean that, of course, you don't have the big publications, but you have a lot of, very solid publications, which means that everybody has been successful. But still, at this time, that's not being seen as being as successful as if you would have a Nature or Science or Cell paper, which hopefully is going to change. And we're going into that direction, but I think it's still an issue.
In 2009, you received the MRC Career Development Award. And in 2015, the Cancer Research UK Program Foundation Award. And do you think these awards influence somehow in the way people see and treat you? And this create a charge on yourself, like to keep the spotlight place?
So I'm not necessarily, so these awards are big research grants, right? So big pots of money for a long period of time. So the Career Development Award was for 6 years and the Program Foundation was for 6 years, which allows me to run a lab for that amount of time for, you know, about 10 people. So these awards allowed me financially to run a lab. I think what had more of an effect is that based on the fact that I got this money, I was promoted at the university. And a big difference was when I became a full professor. So people have some kind of image of a full professor, right? That is very prestigious. So if you go to a talk or invited or introduced, right, people really emphasize the fact that, you know, this is Professor de Bruin who's going to. So I think the academic level, so the professor level, that made more of an influence than getting the funding. Of course, I needed the funding to get promoted in the university. And of course, that kind of snowballs. So if you get these awards, it's not so much that you get these awards, you also have money to do research and then to publish well. And then people invite you to speak somewhere. And if you then become professor, right, that just snowballs. So that just gets, so the awards were definitely instrumental, but I think the how people view me was more important what my title was than whether I had these awards or not.
What do you think about the importance of outreach events from the researcher for society? I'm sorry.
So this kind of harks back to the, well, what's it, the first question, right? Where you have these, you know, where the general population is more likely to believe fake news because that suits them better. I think now it's even more important than before to do outreach, right? And the most important thing is to do outreach with school children, right? Because a lot of the older generation, if they now start, they don't want to believe in facts, right? It's very hard to change their minds. But we have to ensure that the next generation still believes in science and still believes in scientific facts. So the only way to ensure that in the future this is not going to get worse is to do outreach events for primary school and secondary school children, just to let them know what science is about. Also to let them know that there's a career in science. And this is both for making sure that people still believe in science and facts, but it's also making sure that we'll have an inclusive scientific community. So if you look at the scientific community, there's a lot of underrepresented people are not filtering through. And I mean, this is both even with gender. If you look at female professors, right, the percentage of female professors is really low. But it's also, of course, underrepresented communities, which is either social, economic issues, you know, poorer communities are less likely to go into academia, but also racial issues, right, are less likely to. So the only way to change this is to make sure that all the children know about science, know about how exciting science is, and know about the opportunities, right? So there are two things that you will do with these outreach events. Is both to let them know that science and facts matter, and second, that this is an opportunity. And if we don't do that, if we don't get a very inclusive research environment, we lose excellence, right? We lose, because all of these people, if, for instance, if you don't get females filtering all the way through to professors, we are not using 50% of the talent that is out there, right? So I think it is absolutely, it's always been very important. And in these days, it is absolutely essential that we all participate in outreach events. It is not very easy, right? Because we are used to talking to a lot of researchers that are experts. And so we're using a lot of jargon, a lot of language that is really hard to understand. So if you go into schools, you really have to think about how you can explain what you're doing. But that has such a benefit to your own work, because if you have to explain it to a child, then you really have to understand your research, right? Then you also really understand what you're trying to do and how it fits in and why it's important. So I think it's absolutely essential to do this, both for community and the society as a whole, but also for your own research is very beneficial.
In Brazil, we are living a really hard moment in the pandemic since March. And after 7 months, we still have almost 1,000 deaths per day. being the second country in the number of deaths besides the sub-notifications, we are having only classes and reduced activity on the laboratories that are being resumed on scale models and other precautionary means. How is it going on London?
So it's very similar here. I mean, the cases are not as high, but of course the measures are probably more extreme than they are in Brazil. So for lockdown, what you can and cannot do. So for instance, for my research institute, we have a limited number of people that can be in the building at any one time. So my group is about 12 people, but it can only be 5 people in the building at any one time. So we really have to decide who's going to go in and when, because sometimes you carry out an experiment that takes a couple of days or 3 days. And of course, so I have to come up with a schedule to allow everybody to go into the lab, to be productive in some sense, but of course means that I'm not going into the institute, because what it would be, I would go into the institute, just sit in an office there, which would mean that somebody couldn't go into the lab. So at the moment, it's all right. I mean, people are being productive and I'm trying to be fair to everybody, but there are restrictions where we were still not as productive as we could be if it was all open. So, and it could change. So it seems like cases are going up here. There are more restrictions and there could be another lockdown, which means that nobody can go anywhere, but we'll see.
How do you think the cell cycle can contribute to other research areas?
So, I mean, if you think about the cell cycle is at the basis of life, right? All cells, all living cells at the moment originated from a single cell that just divided and of course evolved and so. So any disease should be seen in the context of the cell cycle. For instance, aging is a huge topic now. And it's very clear that the cell cycle has a very important role in this. You know, the DNA damage, the response to DNA damage during the cell cycle. So I think any type of disease, you should see it in the context of the cell cycle. So I think any understanding of the fundamental ways in which a cell cycle is controlled can or will have some importance in any type of disease. Okay,
we are done with the questions. Thank you so much for responding our questions. It was really a pleasure to hear all your responses because of the subject and because of the experience of talking to another scientist from another country. I think it was really nice.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you very much for taking the time to ask the questions. I hope that you guys realize that we're all alike, we're all the same.
Sure.
I'm just like you, just a bit older.
We are the same, but a little different.
But really, thank you a lot. Like, you don't know how grateful it is to see someone like you being here with us and say the things that you're saying is like really inspiring, motivating, and it's really good to hear something like that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. And good luck with your studies.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're gonna need it.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.